Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. We'll get started inshallah. I'm not sure how many people are watching this. I'm not even sure if the audio is working, but I'll just continue nonetheless. So I guess the idea was that we're coming to the end of 2022. We're actually just an hour out from technically it being a new calendar year. So it makes sense for a lot of people to be sort of reviewing what they're doing with their life and what they've achieved in the last 12 months or so. It's only natural for that to happen. It's not that this time is a sacred time or anything like that from a Muslim perspective. But nonetheless, I guess it is an opportunity for us to sort of reflect and to basically hold ourselves accountable before we are held accountable ultimately by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment. So what I wanted to do, I guess, is to sort of begin by looking at the hierarchy of deeds. I know I've sort of already streamed this on Twitch, and I'm not sure how many people have actually have had access to that. So what I'm going to do is sort of divide this stream into maybe 3 parts or so. So the first part would just be focusing on the hierarchy of deeds. Then secondly, showing how you can sort of use it as a way to sort of measure yourself in various aspects of life in terms of how you've done in 2022. And then I guess you can sort of branch out, and sort of the third part would be how do you use it to actually prioritize goal setting, I guess, for the next year. I think it's also important. There's a lot of studies about the idea of setting New Year's resolutions, and I guess everyone's trying to go back to the gym or do something healthy or sort of improve some aspect of life. And I think last time I sort of looked at the research and stuff, starting a New Year's resolution or setting a goal, I guess, at the beginning of the year, you're statistically more likely to actually achieve that goal than, I guess, if someone was to set a goal at any other time of the year. So it's actually quite interesting that there's actually a benefit of actually doing this at this particular time of year as well. So I guess I'd start off with this big question, this big hairy question, which is, what is a good Muslim? And I guess depending on who you ask, you'll get as many answers. But the idea is that I think, in short, you would assume that a good Muslim would obviously be a Muslim, meaning they would have the right foundational beliefs. And then above that, depending on who you ask, some people may prioritize the fact that they don't harm people. They might say that they have to benefit other people, etc., etc. And I guess when we look at Islam, it's not a subjective experience. It's not like there's this idea that there's one Islam for some people and there's another Islam for other people. There's actually a standard that's sort of very firmly established by the two aspects of revelation. So you've got the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Nusus, and then you've got basically the derivation that comes from them. And generally the Sharia, or those two particular forms of legislation, then form the sacred body of text, or the sacred law of Islam, which is understood as fiqh. So the scholars followed particular schools of thought and of derivation of principles, etc., and they would come up with particular frameworks of actually understanding one's relationship with other people. So I guess the idea here is that it's a multifaceted thing. So a Muslim can't be a good Muslim by exceedingly doing well in one aspect of life whilst neglecting others. So I guess that becomes apparently true. So for instance, it's not enough for someone to be good to their neighbor but not have a relationship with their prayer, or it's not enough for them to be charitable but for them to then neglect their parents or something else along those lines. So I guess the idea is that it's a multifaceted approach, and so when we answer this question, we need to be specific, but also we need to sort of be comprehensive, and that's where sort of the hierarchy of deeds comes from. So the idea here is that, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's an understanding that humans need to prioritize particular things over others. And so, in short, the objective or the mission of sort of this model that I've sort of been working on for the last maybe close to 10 years or so, is the fact that you need to strategize your life. So it's not sufficient for you to sort of meander through life and sort of just respond like the animals do to their environments and stuff like that. And then everyone's going through school, so you go through school. Everyone's going to university, so you go to university. There's going to come a point in life where you're going to have to wake up to yourself and sort of ask the bigger questions, like, was this the right decision? Am I on the right path? Etc., etc. So there needs to be a strategizing of maturation. And but what I mean by maturation is also it's a very specific thing. It's basically assuming that there's a natural progression that you have in life that comes with time. And unfortunately what happens is you have certain people that would be described as man children or adults as children, which are people that have reached a certain age but haven't hit a particular milestones. And obviously, like, this isn't to go to the extreme where people are just competing with each other for the sake of competing, and sort of you're always comparing yourself to other people and feeling behind. But rather, it's like, what's the natural time? There's like a window of time that you should do particular things in your life, and you need to hit those milestones. And generally, if you're feeling upset or inadequate or all these other things, partly that could be due to the fact that you're on social media and you're comparing your life to other people. But a lot of the time, it could be the fact that you didn't prioritize particular things in your life, and that's why you're struggling. And I guess that's what the model tries to do, is actually pinpoint what those areas are, and then how do you actually improve those things. The other aspect of it is it's standardizing self-help. So like when I talk about the hierarchy of deeds or my approach to life, I'm sort of merging 3 or 4 different aspects of my lived experience, I guess, if you want to call it that. So one aspect of it is that if you're anyone really like that is ambitious, driven, wants to achieve a lot of things in life, inevitably you're going to start watching videos or reading self-help books. So obviously there's like a lot of criticism around how toxic they could be in terms of like the ideals and the lifestyle that they promote. But there is a lot of benefit in them, undoubtedly. But I guess there's a question as to what extent do these books actually, to what extent can you action them in your life? And then maybe a more specific critique is, to what extent can a Muslim action those things into their life? So for example, you read something like The Barefoot Investor when it comes to finance, and in there he will talk about how ING is good and how you need to put your savings into a high interest yielding account. And obviously a Muslim can't reads that page and just continues reading. They can't implement those things. Likewise, like you read stuff in like whether it's Stephen Covey or all these other sort of self-help books that sort of come about, they have certain limitations that apply to the general masses, but then there's an additional limitation when it applies to Muslims. And so there's that aspect of like self-help books, taking like the best that you can from them. Then a second aspect of life that I'm sort of incorporating to this is the Muslim aspect of it. So without sort of being particular, naming names in terms of people or organizations that I sort of don't like the fact that they try to hijack this productivity stuff and slap some Islamic words onto them, some Arabic words here and there, and sort of repackage it and sort of people eat it up like hotcakes. Like, I'm really against that idea. It's not a very genuine thing whereas if you want to make a general contribution to literature or to anything else, like what you actually need to do, especially if you're coming at it from the perspective of a Muslim, is actually, what does Islam actually say about these things? What did the scholars, the ulama, the fuqaha, what did they actually say in their books about these particular aspects of life and how one should prioritize them? So I'll give a quick example. A lot of the time, like when you leave high school and all these other things, you're sort of told, okay, make a to-do list, make a calendar, and there's like these basic things that like hopefully everyone's doing already. But then you might be introduced to like frameworks. So like frameworks like the urgent, non-urgent, important, non-important quadrants. So basically you draw like a table, there's a quadrant, and basically there's stuff that's important and urgent, and that's what you should be working on right now. Then there's stuff that's important, but it's not urgent. So that's stuff that you can procrastinate a little bit about, but you shouldn't procrastinate too much, etc. So you got these 4 quadrants. And like the sort of blaringly obvious issue with these quadrants as a framework, for example, is who determines what is important? So is important what you feel is important? Is important what society thinks is important? Or is important what Islam dictates to us to be important? And so that's sort of like the added framework that I'm trying to add into this. So so basically it's combining self-help, Islam, hopefully it comes across as genuine. And I guess the other aspect of it is like those management consulting frameworks, those really cool ways of actually using things and structuring things, ensuring things are like, for example, MISI, so mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. These are principles that you pick up from the business world. And though there's a lot of exaggeration in terms of how important these things are, undoubtedly there's a lot of benefit in those things as well. And so once you combine those 2 or 3 aspects of sort of what you have, you come up with some sort of framework that actually incorporates Islam, self-help, and like is something that's actually scalable and standardized. The last thing I'll say just quickly before I actually come into the model would be that you have some sobering realizations when you do this model. So what I mean by that is typically, if you're a quote unquote practicing Muslim and you're in a Western society context, there's a lot of degeneracy within the community that inevitably would make you feel like you're actually on a pedestal. So what I mean by this is you walk into a room, most people may not know Arabic, may not be able to pronounce the tajweed of the Quran properly, etc., etc. There's many other things that you can go on about. But the idea here is that if you walk into that room and you think, mashallah, I've done this, I've done that, you'll start growing ahead. Basically, you might become arrogant, you might sort of think very highly of yourself, and these are obviously from the diseases of the heart. And these are particular ways that shaitan misguides the righteous people, especially. But the idea here is that that's not the standard. No one said that the Muslim living in the West with a post-colonial context that has had generations ruined and secularized and all these other things, no one said that that's the example that you should be comparing yourself to. And so the sobering realization is when you score yourself, and this scale that you'll sort of see that I'll quickly present is, it goes from a negative 70 all the way to a plus 100. So 100, positive 100 is the best score that you can have. But you'll quickly realize that it's impossible to reach 100. And if you just pass, like if you're just like in this scoring, like the pass score would be like, if you score like a 10 out of 100, you're doing well compared to all the people that I've surveyed. So I've already run this with about maybe half a dozen or so people. And when they run their scores and stuff like that, they realize that either they're negative or they're just positive and all these other things. And then it's sobering because you realize, whoa, there's like so much to my development that's still ahead of me that needs to be happening. And I think the real positive of that is the fact that you realize you're not as good as you thought you were, and you always have something to improve on. And as long as a Muslim is trying to work towards improving themselves, I think this is a good thing. So there's a few sobering realizations that people will have. I think the other aspect of it is that that's important for me to highlight is that this is a work in progress. So this is something that is not perfect. As you'll see, there's many flaws in the model, and I'm actually open to that feedback. So one of the things I'm doing is actually going to mashayikh and experts in those particular areas that I talk about, and actually asking them, okay, does this model work? So for example, I've already spoken to a couple of mashayikh about some of the Islamic stuff, but let's just say, for example, when it comes to personal health, I would go to someone that's like a personal trainer or a dietitian, or someone that's working in that field, someone that's got qualifications in those particular fields, because as Muslims, we obviously have to ask the people of knowledge if we don't know, and it's impossible for someone to know everything. So you naturally have to go to experts for them to be able to actually tell you, okay, this is actually good, this is actually bad, you should probably change this, you should probably rearrange this. And that's sort of what it's doing. And lastly, I guess, do your own research. Like every presentation that I give, I don't think that I've mastered everything, I know everything, nor do I feign that. I just caveated the fact that I don't. And I could just be a flop. I could just be some random guy sitting here at 11 o'clock on a random night, presenting something to you, and can be completely unfounded. So always be critically minded. Don't blind follow people when it comes to these particular things, and always do your own research. So let's get into it. So the hierarchy of deeds is like usul al-fiqh. Like you can define it by mufradain. You can say, okay, there's what is a hierarchy, what are deeds, and then you can obviously define it by making it murakkab, making it together. And so the way I would approach it is I would do it like how a lot of scholars explain usul al-fiqh, which is to understand the concepts individually and then to put them together. So when we talk about the hierarchy, what I'm talking about here is a way of prioritization. And as a Muslim who believes that in the 6 pillars of Iman, the fact that we will be held accountable, our deeds are actually important. It's not an insignificant conversation. And the outcomes of those are they're two very opposite extremes. Over here I visualize that by the fire, and we know in Islam the fire is black, the hellfire is black, as per the hadith, and we also know that there are 7 gates to the hellfire. So I've just visualized that, and for paradise I've just represented it with a good book. I thought of this for so long, what icon I should use for this, and I just said I've got to move on. But we all know that we will receive our book of deeds either in our right hand or our left hand / behind our back. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those that have the book in their right hand and are able to access paradise through His mercy. Now, those are the two extremes. Now, how does a hierarchy form from this? So what you have is basically, you have the lowest thing. So like, I guess, real basics of Islam, you know that for every action has a ruling, and those rulings sit on a spectrum of about 5 categorical areas. And obviously, like some scholars, some madhahib go specific into the fact that some of these categories have 2 types, and arguably there's 6 or 7 categories. But just for simplification, rulings sit on a spectrum between something being prohibited and something being obligatory. And then you have a midpoint, which is something being permissible. So it's neither, you're neither liable for punishment or reward. And then you have stuff that is in between. So on the prohibited side, you have things that are disliked, and on the obligatory side, you have things that are recommended. And I won't go into like perhaps when I do some presentations on usul al-fiqh and stuff like that, we'll go into actually the details of how the scholars talk about obligations and how are they determined and all the rest of it. But the idea here is that it's important to realize that not all actions are the same. That's the point that I'm making. And the same action, according to the time or the way that it's done, can change its ruling. So if, like, let's just take a canonical example of, say, prayer. So prayer can be, is the 5 daily prayers are, for example, individually obligatory upon the person who is obligated. But for instance, if you were to pray some prayers that are recommended, but you pray them at the prohibited time, then you're doing something that is prohibited, even though the action itself is good. The timing of it is wrong. And there's many other examples that we can give. But the idea is that there's many variables that go into determining whether what you are doing at that time is the optimal thing that you should be doing. And I guess the worst thing that anyone could do at any point in time, and that's the bottom level, are the nullifiers of Islam. So the nawaqid of Islam, the nullifiers of Islam, are very similar to the nullifiers of wudu. That you make wudu through one door, and that is through obviously purifying yourself with water in that particular sequence and whatnot, on the 4 major limbs. And then what happens is that if you were to do a particular action, you were to pass wind, go to the bathroom, etc., this would nullify the wudu. Likewise, you have the nullifiers of Islam, where once you enter the Islam through the door of taking the shahada and believing in it with the conditions and the prerequisites, etc., then if you were to do one of these nullifiers, it would put into question at the bare minimum your Islam. And there's many books that are written in this genre of which sits under the sort of broader area or faculty of Aqidah. But the idea would be that there are some actions that are so bad that they take one outside the fold of Islam. And here I've used a pun of shirk, the nullifiers, because in English shirk means to sort of like leave something or to abstain from something. And shirk is obviously one of the nullifiers. So these are just one of the puns and stuff that I put into this stuff. It's amusing to myself, but obviously like not many people like these puns and stuff. But anyways, you shirk the nullifiers, you stay away from them, you abstain. And there's 10 of them that Sheikh, like for example, if we go off the book of Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he mentions 10 of these, and I'll come to those in a second. But for now, I'm just listing these so to build out the framework. So you've got the hierarchy, and the worst action that you could do, irrespective of time and place, are the nullifiers of Islam. Obviously, just before I continue, the nullifiers obviously have mawani of takfir, like there's particular things that are preventers of someone making takfir. So just because someone does one of these nullifiers, it doesn't automatically qualify that they're a disbeliever. That goes from a discussion of aqidah to a discussion of fiqh, where a qadi or a judge has to basically go through particular steps to ensure that this person has done this without coercion, whilst knowing these things, etc., etc. And there's many details to this topic, but it suffices to say that there's nullifiers of Islam. So, for example, someone, I don't know, point blank, so there's no difference of opinion on this. Someone worships an idol. Someone bows down to an idol, they're not coerced, they know that it's wrong, etc. Then this person has nullified their Islam, as an example. So just to move on. Then you've got the mubiqat. So the mubiqat are the destructive sins. And there's 7 of these, and this is mentioned in various narrations of a particular hadith. And I'll mention these later as well. But the idea here is that the destructive sins are a layer above the major sins. So if you want to think about it, everyone knows that there's major sins and there's minor sins, and I'll come to that in a second. But the idea here is that the destructive sins are a tier above the normal sins that there are. And so it's important to leave those as well. And when we talk about major sins, so like major sins typically are there's, again, this is a genre itself. Imam al-Dhahabi's got a book on it that he mentions the kaba'ir, or the major sins. And I guess the idea here is that he lists about 70. So from his perspective, there's about 70 major sins. And just on major sins, it's important to understand what this is before we continue. The idea is that a major sin, according to the majority of scholars, requires someone to make specific repentance for them. So what I mean by that is minor sins, on the other hand, are forgiven, a lot of scholars say, through general repentance. So saying something like astaghfirullah, or something like this. These things, or the hadith that talk about from one Ramadan to another Ramadan, or from one Friday to another Friday, or from one prayer to another prayer, or the one that prays is like walking through a river, he bathes himself 5 times a day, his sins are removed. Whenever there's a hadith that talks in those general ambiguous terms, saying something like, or if you do this deed, all your sins are forgiven, a lot of scholars will say that this refers to the minor sins. So for example, a minor sin might be to, some scholars will say, if you do something makruh, if you leave off something that is mustahab repetitively. Some scholars will say minor sins are specific actions that are listed. So for example, eating while you are already full, and all these other things. There's actually, in the introductions of books on major sins, in the Muqaddimah, there'll be sections that some scholars will actually mention what are minor sins by comparison, or to understand major sins, obviously comparing it to minor sins and what those minor sins are. But without going into too much detail about that, the idea is that major sins, according to a lot of scholars, will require specific repentance. And so what that means is that it's not enough for you to make dua for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you, but rather you actually have to ask Allah specifically for that sin. So for example, you missed a prayer, okay? You must specifically ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you for that specific prayer that's been missed. Or for example, someone, may Allah protect us, drank alcohol. So they would have to actually ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically to forgive them for that sin of drinking alcohol, because that's one of the major sins. So major sins are on a higher level, and typically the way that we know something is a major sin as opposed to a minor sin or other than that is that the modality of the prohibition is higher. And many a time, scholars will also mention one of the ways that you know something is a major sin is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will promise a punishment for that person. So we know the famous verse that whoever kills a believer intentionally, for them there are like a list of punishments, including the anger of Allah and His punishment, etc., etc. Then we know that killing is a major sin. So that's just an example. But the idea here is that there's destructive sins, and Imam al-Dhahabi mentions all 7 of these as a part of the major sins. And then Imam al-Dhahabi also mentions shirk as one of the major sins. And then he starts talking about things that are prohibited. And he also talks about obligations that are left off. So for example, he'll say the one who misses the prayer, that's a major sin. And so I guess the idea here is that, just to unpack another idea, is that the question might arise in one's mind, what is the difference between a prohibition and an obligation? It seems that the effect of them is the same, but it's actually not. The way that you know something is a prohibition is, again, this is usul al-fiqh, the way that the wording of the hadith or the verse would be in the form of it's a talab of tark. So it's a command to leave off something. So whereas an obligation is a talab, a seeking of someone to do something. If you study Arabic, you'll know that obviously verbs have past tense, present, future tense, and command tense. So if something typically comes as a default as the command tense, then we know that it's an obligation. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ, and establish the prayer. Because it's in the plural command tense, then we know that this is an obligation. It's not a recommendation or a suggestion for us to do these things. It's actually an expectation for us to do these things. So the idea here is that there's these obligations, and then there's prohibitions. And a prohibition would say, for example, don't go near zina, for example. Then the idea would be, is because it says la, the la of nahi, the la of prohibition is used, that means it's a prohibition. So that's the difference between an obligation and a prohibition. But the idea here is that another question that arises in usul al-fiqh is the idea that, do you prioritize leaving off the prohibitions, or do you prioritize fulfilling the obligations? And this is an important concept to understand as well. The scholars of usul al-fiqh, they'll mention the fact that a person should leave off the prohibitions as a priority to doing the obligation. So obviously they should try to do both, abandoning the prohibitions and fulfilling the obligations. But what takes a higher level is the prohibitions. And there's many evidences on this, and maybe when we cover usul al-fiqh, we might sort of cover this. But the idea here is that for you to leave something is assumed to be easier than for you to actually do something. So an omission is easier than an action. And we can unpack that maybe later. But the idea is that you will first try to leave off the prohibitions before you do the obligations. Or as Hassan al-Basri mentioned, that like it's better for you to sort of purify your garment before you apply perfume to it. To use that sort of analogy, the idea of asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness, etc., before doing good deeds. Likewise, leaving the prohibitions before you fulfill the obligations. And then I guess once a Muslim has fulfilled the obligations, then they should try to leave off that which is prohibited. And things that are makruh are not just like detestable, like they're not disliked. It's not like, oh, it's just makruh, I'll just do it. Makruh, according to a lot of scholars, is like actually something that is distasteful, and is something that you should like leave. And obviously some scholars would then, like with obligations, like the Hanafis would divide wajib and fard separately. And the Hanabila also do that in particular aspects of worship and some particular chapters. So for example, we will say that saying the Bismillah before wudu is wajib, but wiping the head is an obligation. And there's other sort of details. But I won't go into the idea. But the idea here is that a lot of scholars separated between wajib and fard. But the idea here is that wajib and fard, here in this thing, to not complicate it further, is one thing. Then you have makruh. And makruh, obviously, as I was alluding to before, some scholars separate makruh. So the Hanafis, for example, will say there's makruh tahrimi and there's makruh tanzihi. So the idea is that there's makruh which is closer to haram, and there's makruh which is lesser than haram. And not to again confuse people, but the idea is that there's detestable actions that you shouldn't do. And so then you've got the idea that once you've sort of left off the prohibited actions, naturally the next action for you to do would be to adhere to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in those actions that are recommended for you to do. And then ultimately there's something called saint mode. So saint mode isn't it's like I've come up with this word as a part of the framework, but the idea here is that what's the pinnacle of that thing? Like if you were to say salah, what is the pinnacle of salah? If you were to say enjoining good and forbidding evil, what is the pinnacle of that thing? And so saint mode is like what's the highest rank that one can have in that particular aspect. So if you want to think about it, you've got this hierarchy, and then like if you were to slice it, like if it was like a pyramid, you would have deeds. And as I was mentioning before, a Muslim isn't just a good Muslim if they do one particular action well. They have to have an all-rounder approach to many aspects of their life and excel at multiple aspects of their life. And I'll come to that in a second. But the other aspects of the framework that I've added is like a scoring system. And it's a bit awkward explaining this, to be honest. When I explain it to a lot of people, they sort of giggle and laugh. But the idea here is that I sort of see it like your carbon footprint. So like obviously like before, when the world is very black and white and you have these particular ideas that, okay, all the solutions to the Ummah's problems are you've got a state and you implement Islam and all these other things, which ultimately is the solution. But I guess when you're sort of working on yourself or you're trying to mentor other people, there needs to be like a very tangible way of sort of explaining how their behavior impacts the society and community. And undoubtedly there is an impact of your individual behavior on the rest of society and the rest of the world. And I know some people sort of try to downplay this, but there's many verses and hadith that indicate upon this. But anyways, the idea here is that imagine carbon footprint. So that greeter, that activist might actually like me for this, not much else. But the idea is that you've got, when you think of carbon footprint, you understand that, okay, when you drive your car or you do something, you pollute particular gases into the, and the greenhouse effect increases temperatures and climate change. And we all probably know this because we've all grown up with understanding climate change. But the idea here is that what you try to do is you try to offset that carbon by doing something like planting a tree or doing something else. So the way I sort of use that as an analogy to explain the hierarchy and the way it works is that when you do something that's very abhorrent, you're like polluting sins into society, and you're causing the downgrading of society as a whole. And if you're someone that does good actions, then you're sort of like offsetting people's evil. And And if enough people were to be good and enough people were to resist being evil, you would see society change. And it sounds like a very oversimplification of something that you might have heard elsewhere, but that's increasingly the grand theory that I actually think of. That the idea here is that every single Muslim needs to be net neutral. And for them to be net neutral, I'll explain these lines, is that they obviously can't be a disbeliever, because if you're a disbeliever, you're like polluting a lot. But the idea here is that you can't be a major sinner, because if you're a major sinner, meaning, and that's defined as committing the destructive sins, doing the prohibitions, and neglecting the obligations, then you're actually causing our community harm by polluting sins into the atmosphere, if you want to think about it that way. And then, like, once you hit zero, so on the left-hand side, you might see the number 0. The idea is that once you hit 0, what you're actually doing is you're carbon neutral, you're sin neutral. So what I'm trying to say there is that you're not sinning. And I know, like, this sounds very, like, angelic or something like that. But the idea is that there is a metric by which you can know that you are doing enough. Excuse me. And I was talking to a couple of brothers about this the other day, actually, yesterday, I think. The idea is that as a Muslim, some people, and I used to make this argument before, and since have stopped, how do you know you've done enough as a Muslim? How do you know that you've actually done enough for you to, like, what is that even as a question? And I know that from a spiritual perspective, no one should ever ask themselves that question. But it is a question that can be answered from a legal perspective. From a fiqh perspective, you can answer that. And there's precedence of this. I was talking to the brothers about this. There's a very famous hadith, which maybe I'll do like collect the different explanations by different scholars and do a detailed deep dive into that hadith, because it's actually very profound and less explained in the general reminders and khutbahs and stuff like that. But what it does is it highlights the fact that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were different. There were some companions that wanted to enter paradise through all the 8 gates. There were some companions that would be on every battle and they would want to be the first in the prayer and all these other things. They would want to memorize the entire Quran, etc. But then you had companions that were, for lack of a better phrase, more average in their approach to their religion. And what that just meant is that they were ordinary people, they had businesses, they had families, they had normal lives that they lived. But obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed them and selected them to be from the companions, those that believed in the Prophet ﷺ whilst he was alive and died upon belief, as the scholars of hadith define a companion as. But the idea here is that some of them would ask questions, and from the way that they would ask questions, you can infer their personality. So we know that Hudayfa radiallahu anhu would ask questions about the bad stuff, like what are the bad signs of the, what are the like negative stuff, and whereas some people would ask about the good. And you see that there's different ways that the companions would ask questions. But to sort of bring it to this particular hadith, the idea is that there's a companion that asked the Prophet ﷺ about what he needed to do. So a Bedouin comes in, he accepts Islam, he asks the Prophet ﷺ about the actions of Islam, and basically he's told that about the 5 daily prayers. And then he says, and I'm narrating this obviously by meaning to save time. The idea is that he says there's 5 daily prayers. Okay, is there more than this? And the Prophet ﷺ says no. Then he says about zakat. He tells him about the amount. And he says, is there more than this? He says no. And basically what he says is, like, every time he asks a question, he says, I will do the minimum and no more. And when he leaves, the Prophet ﷺ turns to the companions and says that if he is indeed truthful in this, then he'll be successful. And so what that means is that if there's some people that just want to do the minimum, there's some people that they want to do the 9 to 5, nothing more, and that applies to religion as well for some people. And sometimes people ask, okay, what's the minimum that I need to do? And this framework hopefully seeks to answer that. It was like, okay, just do your obligations, stay away from the prohibitions, and now you're carbon neutral, you're sin neutral. But then what happens is there's an idea that you can still be a minor sinner, and all of us obviously need to make repentance and all this other stuff. And then, like, if you're like from the sabiqeen or the sabiqun, depending on the Arab of it, basically the idea is that you can be from the forerunners, and these are the people that are causing the revival of the community the most. So if you're someone, for example, that has memorized the entire Quran and you teach it to other people, then you are someone that is basically inculcating the culture and preserving the religion for the next generation, much more than someone who, for example, doesn't know how to read the Quran, or for instance, has just memorized Juz Amma or something like that. like there's a hierarchy here. There's an actual difference. There's a palpable difference between people. And I know a lot of people in the modern sensitivities doesn't like the idea of hierarchies. Modern sensitivities don't like the idea that someone is better than someone else. But like from a legal perspective and from an obvious perspective, some people cause more benefits to society than others. Some people cause more harm to society than others. And so for us to assume that everyone's the same and should be treated the same, then this is obviously something that is that goes against the intellect. So the idea here is that you have these ranks. And like another thing, like last question before I move on to the deeds, like a question might come into your mind and then be like, okay, we know there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ would seek a lot of istighfar, 100 times a day, for example. So like, what happens here? Like, how do we understand this? If his previous sins are forgiven, his future sins are forgiven, as we know. And like this is typically covered in Aqidah. There's a section under prophethood about Isma, like the idea of the prophet being infallible or the prophets being infallible. And in here, there's like a detailed discussion around how the idea that when we come across an evidence that indicates upon one of the prophets asking for forgiveness or all these other things, because we believe that they were infallible and by consensus they never committed major sins, and then the scholars differ in terms of like what they could and couldn't do. But the idea here would be that there's a natural subhanAllah, what was I saying? There's a saying, I'm forgetting the Arabic right now, but basically there's a saying that the lack of like a shortcoming in worship is a sin for a saint. Meaning a saint, like I'm not saying like a saint from the perspective that you go to the guy's grave and you worship him, but what I'm trying to say is someone that's a sage, someone that's like worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for years on end, has istiqamah, is pleading to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at night to accept his deeds and forgive his sins. The sins that they're asking for forgiveness of are not necessarily sins that you and I can relate to. So it's not like the Prophet ﷺ is asking Allah to forgive him for a major sin that he has committed, because we believe that he didn't commit major sins, or sins more generally, according to a lot of most scholars and stuff. But the idea here is that the forgiveness that he is seeking is forgiveness for potential shortcomings in his worship. And so the idea here is that a person can be righteous and still seek istighfar. And this is an important concept to understand because people may misunderstand that. So anyways, so we've got this hierarchy. Hopefully we've sort of explained that, unpacked that quite well. And then you've got the deeds. Okay, now this is very, very important because there's a lot, like I pressed one button and all these deeds appeared, and I really want to sort of go through this one by one, but the transitions didn't allow me to because this is Google Sheets and not PowerPoint. And I always prefer Microsoft. But for things to be shareable, you have to use Google for some reason. Al-Muhim, the point is that you've got 5 aspects of life, or 5 categories of deeds, is how I've structured it. And where did I get this from? Again, I'm not making any of this up. I'm just repackaging things. The fuqaha, they categorize the sharia or fiqh into different aspects. So some scholars would say, okay, there's 2 categories. There's worship and your relationships with other people. Then some scholars will say, okay, that's not specific enough. There's worship, and then your relationships with other people break up into 2 categories of your business transactions and your family dealings. And some scholars will say, no, you need to also add a judiciary. And so the mutaakhirin of the Hanabila, the latter-day Hanabila, and throughout our history, more generally speaking, they would divide fiqh into 4 major sections. So you have worship, finance, family, and judiciary. Okay, so in ibadat, the tartib of those are important. I'll quickly explain that as well. What I mean by that is the scholars will always talk about worship before finances, because ultimately our purpose is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then what happens is it's not good enough for you to just like sit in the masjid all day and worship and society would function. You do need an economy, you do need employment, you do need money to go around. You do need people to donate and all these other things. And that's where like finances typically come in. So finances or mu'amalat, basically, they cover things of like transactions, partnership structures, and all these other things that maybe we'll cover another time. But the idea here is that the scholars will say that once you've fulfilled your needs from a worship perspective, naturally you need food and all these other things. And unless you're going to like barter and grow your own wheat and stuff, economies form. Like Adam Smith and like all modern economists understand the idea that societies move towards specialization. And so you need to basically become employable, earn a living that's halal, obviously from the questions on the Day of Judgment, how you earned and how you spent. And so the finances is an integral part of an Islamic framework. Then once you've got enough money, so maybe you graduate university, you get a job, you're picking up a trade, now you've got money, the natural tendency of a human being is to want companionship, particularly of the opposite gender. And so this is where a family would form. So you're standing up on your own 2 feet, you've got money, you go, you ask for a sister's hand, you get married, you have kids, etc., etc. Now, when you are dealing in business and you've got a family, typically what happens is there's disputes that arise. And that's why judiciary comes last. So the judiciary so after fiqh al-usra, the family, then you've got the idea of the judicial system of Islam to sort of basically deal with disputes between people, particularly in finance and in family. So in this, you'll cover things like what is the kafara, like the expiation of particular things that people will do. What is the hudud, what are the punishments, what are the ta'zir, so not non-penal punishments of Islam, and all these other things. How do you know that in a court system when a witness comes, how do you take the shahada, etc., etc., etc. So you've got these other things. Now there is arguably a separate section of fara'id which are like to do with like inheritance. Some scholars sort of put inheritance between finance and family. A lot of scholars say that inheritance is a separate science within fiqh. But basically, to summarize, you've got 4 sections: worship, finance, family, and judiciary. And then I guess what you've got is like the aspect that I've added to this is increasingly, like in a modern context where there's a lot of research and all these other things that are done, the self is very important. And I was saying this from the perspective that the self, like we worship ourselves, but the idea that being physically and mentally healthy is a very, very important thing for everything else to work. And the example I always give is, like, you go to a masjid where the tarawih or the qiyamul layl is very long, and you'll see all these young brothers who should be fit and healthy, but because they live a very lazy lifestyle, for lack of a better phrase, they're sitting on chairs when you should be standing. So your body, your back, your legs should be able to stand throughout the night if you are able to train themselves, and obviously from a spiritual perspective as well. It requires a lot of willpower. But the idea here is that I think that it's insufficient to have a model that doesn't cover things like your mental health or your physical ability or your diet or your lifestyle choices. That's why I've added the self in addition to the 4 points that the scholars would typically mention. Then what I've done is so this is MECE, like this is practically every aspect of life, and they're mutually exclusive typically. But this is where it becomes a little bit difficult because some things are very hard to categorize in particular aspects. So I've tried my best to sort of make that clear, but I've sort of moved some things around. So for example, zakat is a topic of ibadat. It comes after the kitab as-salat. So, but what I did is I felt that with worship, there's so many aspects of worship. I didn't want to make it a 5th aspect of worship. Instead, I moved it into finances because, like, I want people more so to be conscious that their business interactions and dealings and all these other things are inherently linked with their zakat and the sadaqah that they give. So I've moved those things around. So, like, forgive me for moving some things around. Like, this doesn't match on 100% overlap with the books of fiqh, but generally speaking, it does. So that's just another caveat. So I'll quickly go through these and I'll quickly then show the model. And then, so I think that's the last slide, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, yeah, so then we just talk about the sequence. We've talked about the sequence. And then I'll wrap this up maybe in the next few minutes. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to chuck them into the chat underneath. I also think there's a time lag. So sometimes if I sort of respond to your comment a bit later, that might be because of the lag. Then what we'll do is we'll go back to my Excel sheet that shows all of this. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about goal setting and reviewing and all that other stuff, and we'll wrap up, inshallah. I know we're 5 minutes out from midnight, so it's a very interesting. This is like my first time that I'm doing something like this, like instead of sleeping at this time. I know most people will probably just be watching fireworks on TV or something. But yeah, hopefully this is more entertaining than that. Hopefully it's more colorful as well, if you guys appreciate the amount of color that I've put into this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move my screen thingy here so that it's easier to see the deeds. My head is not that important. So So let's go through this. Okay, so the idea here is that you've got worship, and I guess the most important aspect of worship is salah. Salah cannot be overemphasized in terms of its importance in Islam. Then there's also a lot of, and like what one other thing that this reflects, I forgot to mention, is different manahij. So like, if you go to a brother who's Sufi inclined, he'll tell you, brother, a lot of it has to do with tazkiyah, tasawwuf, purify your heart, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you, remove the blameworthy traits from your heart, add the praiseworthy stuff, read books from Imam al-Ghazali, etc., etc., etc. If you go to a Salafi, the brother will tell you, okay, you need to fix your aqidah, you need to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, avoid shirk, avoid the nullifiers, avoid nifaq, etc., etc., etc. And then if you go to a tablighi brother, he'll tell you, come close firstly, then he'll ask you, like he'll talk about adab, following the sunnah, eating with your hand, wearing your slippers in a particular way, making sure that you're connected to the masjid, going to ta'aleem, reading hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So basically my point is that like every manhaj or every major group of revival seeks to revive a particular aspect of Islam. And as a Muslim, like living in the West, where it's like a melting pot of all these different views, it's very hard to like synthesize all this information into like one method or one model. And hopefully, this is what like this tries to do. So like from a HT, someone from Hizb ut-Tahrir or a HT person will tell you, okay, brother, it's about calling towards khilafah, reviving the way of Islam, etc., etc. And so sort of like we need to incorporate that political aspect of it, even if another group, for example, the Tablighis might be apolitical. So like the idea here is that like each group, and Jazakallah khair to Brother Suvid, like he's someone that I deeply respect and I always bounce ideas off. And we're having a long conversation, maybe like when I do a podcast and I invite him on, this might be one of the topics we'll talk about. And it's basically the idea that, I'm forgetting he's always referencing everything that he's doing, but I can get the reference of him later. But basically you're talking about how one of his teachers was talking about how the companions had different traits. So remember how I was talking about how the companions were all different. One of the other aspects of it is that the companions were also specialists in some aspects, and their personalities were prone towards particular aspects of the religion. And this is why like sometimes you find yourself more inclined towards some things. So this is $1 million question. Does someone become a Sufi because of their personality traits, or is that what they're exposed to? They go to the local masjid and the sheikh is a Sufi, the sheikh is a Salafi, so the person just becomes what they see. Or is it that people have an innate personality that inclines them towards a particular methodology? If someone's more argumentative or if someone's less argumentative, does that sort of like prime them for a particular methodology or a particular aspect of Islam that they find more resonance with? And this is something that like scholars also have talked about. Like when someone seeks knowledge, generally like their first year or two, they sort of get a taste of everything. Similar to like if you did a Bachelor of Commerce at a university, in your first year you do a little bit of finance, marketing, HR, etc. But what ends up happening is you then have to like choose your major or your two majors that you do. And because you've got a taste of everything, your heart generally inclines towards something. So like personally, for example, when I went into university, like I was forced into doing law because of parents and stuff. But the thing I really loved about the HSC subjects I selected was, the subject I loved the most was economics. So I go to university, study economics, and I love the first couple of weeks, but then he goes into econometrics and all these mathematical things and all these models and stuff. And I'm sort of like, hey, this isn't like the whole stuff that we're learning about in the HSC. And so I went into university with a particular assumption of what I wanted to study, but then like I did the first subject of it and I'm like, no. I did the first subject of law and I was like, no, I'm not interested. And so things move, people change, like, and same thing with Islam. Like you might study Islam and fall in love with tafsir because you listen to a particular person that gives reminders on YouTube or something, but then you don't find your heart necessarily inclining towards that. You might incline more towards hadith, or you might incline more towards aqidah or all these other things. And so like my point is that like it's natural, humans are different. And so the point that Suvid's teacher was mentioning was that the companions embodied particular aspects of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you imagine, the perfect exemplar for all of humanity is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the deen is preserved. So meaning the perfect attributes of him are shared amongst the companions, but no companion was so great or on the same level as the Prophet for them to inculcate his entire character. And so basically the Shaykh was saying that you'll find that particular companions inculcated parts of his characteristics more than others, and others would inculcate other attributes of his character more than others. And it's a very deeply profound concept. Like if you look at the Khilafah of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, and the fact that he had Khalid ibn Walid as the military leader, those two complemented one another. Someone that's more compassionate, someone that's more firm against the disbelievers. And then Umar al-Khattab, on the other hand, was very strict, relatively, like he was more stern is probably the better way of saying it, against disbelievers. And so having him and Khalid ibn Walid as the military general was a combination that skewed maybe the pendulum too much in one direction. And so there was a change that was needed. So my point is that the companions complemented one another. It was like a mosaic of tiles. And when you looked at the companions, you saw the character of the Prophet ﷺ. And naturally, then when the companions spread and they dispersed through the land, those characteristic traits were spread across the Muslim world. And if you fast forward to the modern world, the idea here is that what the Shaykh was explaining was that people or methodologies, ideologies that modern Muslims have come up with of revivalism are taking parts of that mosaic, and just like the companions inculcated particular characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ, the methodologies inculcate particular aspects of the Prophet ﷺ. And I think like when you see that as like the worldview, you come to this understanding that no one group has the entire truth. No one group has the perfect sunnah that they are following. They, by necessity, may specialize or focus on a particular attribute of Islam or topic of Islam, and because of that, they have that particular attribute that is prophetic in nature, but they then neglect everything. So a seeker of truth, or the one that wants to sort of have the full experience of the sunnah, would basically or naturally go to different methodologies, go to different mashayikh. For example, like personally I found here in the Sydney context, like I tried very hard to learn about spirituality from like the more Salafi inclined. But no matter how much I tried to listen and all this other stuff, it would not compare to going to a Sufi sheikh. I'm not, by Sufi again, we're not talking about like Sufi Dufi and stuff like that. And I really hate the fact that people sort of see it like that. But you see someone that Sufi, he's on the Sunnah, he's talking about the diseases of the heart, and the depth and the examples and the evidences and the extrapolations that person can have, given the fact that they're part of that methodology, is much better than someone else from a foreign methodology. So for like a more apparent or obvious example would be, okay, if you want to study something to do with modern Muslim history and politics and history and all these other things, if you go to your typical tablighi, and this brother can probably rip the best bayan, and he can make the brothers in the audience cry and really reflect and change their life and convince you to go for 40 days or something like that. But you ask him a political question, it's completely out of his lane, you're going to get like a very botched answer. And so like in summary, what I'm trying to say here is that it's very important that when we ask people of that particular lane or that expertise. But additionally, we don't look down upon other groups because those other groups are neglecting potentially, or from what it seems, they are neglecting a particular aspect of Islam when the companions were a mosaic themselves. So Khalid ibn Walid was great when it came to the military, but it's not necessarily the case that he was the one that was leading the prayer, or he was the one that was teaching people Quran, or he was teaching people about business and transactions. So my point is that the perfect example of the Prophet ﷺ was so perfect and so utmost exemplary that no one companion could embody him completely. And so his characteristics flowed into the companions partially, meaning partially in the sense that parts of it went into certain companions more than it went into others. And those vessels naturally passed down through the generations. And if you look at the modern Muslim world, it's a much more open-eyed way of looking at the world. If you realize that all these groups have khair in them, obviously they might have stuff that you might disagree with and you might sort of advise them and all these other things. But the idea is not to look down upon any other group because from your perspective they're missing out on something, but rather it might be that you're missing out on that thing that they emphasize. I'll move on from there because I guess what I'm trying to say is that when we're talking about this methodology being Misi, The idea is that I'm trying to include everything that every group, every reminder, every khutbah, every book that you might read. This hopefully captures all of that. And it's a very difficult task. Like if you think about life, life is so complex. Life has so many different variables. And to come up with a standardized method to teach to people, it's very difficult. And that's why it looks like there's a lot, but hopefully you appreciate the fact that life is very complex. So that's the methodology. I'm going to probably escape from this presentation and I'll go into the Excel sheet. Now, this is probably a little bit daunting, especially if you're looking at this after midnight here in Sydney. But the idea here is that, like I said, you've got on the left-hand side, the rows are the hierarchy, and I've put them in ascending order. So over here, obviously, when you build a pyramid, you obviously start with the bottom. But when you're looking at it from an Excel sheet perspective, it makes more sense to go in ascending order. So we start off with -5 all the way to +5. And then what happens is you've got the columns of the table have a major column, which would be the section. So the section would be, for example, worship. And then the specific column would be the act of worship itself, such as establish the prayer. And then what would happen is I have these lists. Just give me a second. I have these lists. So what I've done, and this was like from a couple of years ago, I've got to update parts of this. What I did is, I said, what are the nullifiers of Islam? And I said, I'll move myself back to the top right corner. I said, Sheikh Imam Abdul Wahab, he wrote this book. So if you click on this link, hopefully when I fix up my link tree, I'm not sure if Kalamullah even works anymore. That's how old this is. But hopefully when I've got my link tree sorted, this would probably like be on there for people to sort of be able to download and use. So basically the idea here is that, you got the nullifiers of Islam. And basically if you read through this, basically you'll sort of understand, what are the nullifiers, what are the evidences for them, etc. Then I've done the same thing. So Imam al-Dhahabi has the book on major sins. And again, I've tried to use books that are also translated into English. So you've got Imam al-Dhahabi, and he lists, as the content page says, about 70. Obviously, it depends on manuscripts and all these other things, but more broadly, let's just say it's 70 as a round number. And then you've got, I've got other books. So you've got, I started populating this thing about 1,000 sunnah every day and night. And you've got books on the diseases of the heart. So in this particular book that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf explains, then again, especially if you listen to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf pre 9/11, it's pretty solid stuff. Like he talks against a lot of modern ideologies and stuff like that. Obviously, more recently, it's become a bit more controversial, to say the least. But the idea here is that in this explanation, which is on YouTube, he goes through about 25 of the diseases of the heart, and his introduction to the diseases of the heart is one of the best available in English from my perspective. And then basically what you've got here is you answer these questions. So and this sounds very corporate, as KPIs or something, but this is the approach I take to my religion if I'm serious about it. Basically, in the last 12 months, if you want to put it in a sort of survey question, did you commit shirk? Yes or no? And now, hopefully you don't, but let's just say, for example, you go yes, then what should happen? The conditional formatting is not working. It should turn red and whatnot. But basically what happens is this is your checklist. In product, I was looking at this other thing about productivity. Making checklists is a very, very good thing, especially for highly repetitive things such as holding yourself accountable, especially if you do this weekly or monthly or quarterly. The idea is that you go through the list, and what you obviously focus on is the yes. So let's leave the nullifiers of Islam, because hopefully, that's right. The Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's non-political works are actually very great. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Muhammad Trad. Jazakallah khair for the other comments as well. So what I was going to say was that let's take the major sins as an example, okay? So let's just say, for example, and let's just fill this out, perhaps what we might presume from the average Muslim. Okay, so maybe, I'm not going to go through all 70, we'll probably be New Year's again next time if we do that. But basically, let's just say, average Muslim, depending on if he lives in Greenacre or not, hasn't committed murder. But let's just say, let's go, the average Muslim, let's just say, for example, he's not performing the 5 daily salawat. And he goes, yes. The conditional formatting should make this red. But anyways, we'll continue. Let's just say, for example, he hasn't performed Hajj if he's able to do so. Now, obviously, there's a scholarly difference upon whether obligations are ala al-fawr, meaning do you have to immediately do Hajj if you're able to? According to the Hanbalis, yes. But so let's just say, for example, the person is able, he can afford and he's physically able to do Hajj, but he hasn't. He's been procrastinating, or maybe he's trying to save up some annual leave or something like that. Maybe he's also disrespectful to his parents, etc., 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 etc. Maybe maybe he's purchased a house on riba as well. Okay, so we've only looked at the first 12, and then what you can do, is obviously, if you know, you'll filter, and then you can go, okay, only show me what's yes. And you can be like, okay, for the next 12 months, if I want to be a better Muslim, then these are the 4 things I need to focus on. Okay, so that's just a quick example. Let's just say the same thing with the diseases of the heart, that you go through, and maybe that you've got bukhul, like you're miserly, and that's obviously from a shari'i perspective, not paying zakat and stuff, and nafaqat. And then from a maruah perspective, like someone comes to your house, you don't give them water or something to drink or something like that. You're stingy with those things. Let's just say you've got that. And you've got these. And so like basically the idea is that like an underlying principle of all of this is knowledge. That like you won't know what the diseases of the heart are until you actually study them, what are their symptoms, what are their cures, etc. So basically like a lot of it requires learning, but very quickly an average Muslim can go through this list and think, okay, do I fear poverty? That's a disease of the heart. Then I should probably work on that. So I guess the idea here is that you've got these different lists, and again, like I understand that some people may not like Najdi Da'wah, they might not be Athari or Salafi or whatever, so you can maybe use another book of an author that you agree more so with. But the idea is that the methodology or the framework, the idea is that you're going through books that list particular things that you shouldn't be doing or obligations that you should be doing, and then basically listing them into an Excel sheet and then saying, do I do this, do I not do this? And from those, you'll be able to pick that up. So for example, if you want to follow every single sunnah, you go to a book like 1,000 Sunnahs Day and Night. I'm not sure how many people have seen this. It also comes in a small pocket-sized book as well. Maybe you've seen this at Dar es Salaam or something, shameless plug. But the idea here is that the Shaykh, Jazakallah Khair, he basically lists like every single conceivable sunnah from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. Obviously, if you've got the Fortress of a Muslim, which is another small book that you can have, you can also learn the adiyat and stuff like that, the dua that you should make before you go into the bathroom, when you enter the masjid, etc., etc. So basically, you list these out. Then what happens is you've got a scoreboard. Okay, so you've got these lists, and based off the answers, and like this Excel sheet should be sort of linking these sheets together, but I don't think it is. But let's just see if it does. What happens is then you rate where you are. So what I mean by that is, what's the level that you are on? So let's just take an example of Salah, just so that we're sort of thinking. If you're on Salah, and this is an important point, you might notice that there's some grey boxes. That's because not everything has a destructive sin, naturally, because there's only 7 and there's 20 categories. Not everything has a nullifier of Islam, naturally, because there's 10 and there's 20 categories. And sometimes I put the same stuff in the same 2 or 3 of particular things into the same box as well. So basically, you can skip these grey boxes. But the idea here is that, okay, let's look at your Salah. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, Salah. The nullifier of Salah would be that you deny the obligation. And we know that anyone who denies something that is qat'i or definitive in its dalala and its thabut, meaning it's mutawatirly narrated and the interpretation of it is definitive, it's nas, it's not like ta'wil or zahir or other ways of understanding it, then that person has disbelieved, because they've basically effectively put into disrepute, or they've questioned whether the definitive proofs are acceptable. So if someone denies the obligation of Salah, then they have committed a nullifier of Islam. Now, there's no destructive sin pertaining to the Salah, so let's skip that. Then the prohibitions aspect of it would be that they're missing Salah completely, or they're missing it at the prescribed times. So there's people that they don't pray, or they pray sometimes but not other times. Or there's people that they pray, I noticed this when I was in the work context, a lot of Muslims would do this. They wouldn't pray during the day. So what they'll do is they'll miss Dhuhr and Asr, for example, but then when they pray Maghrib, they pray Dhuhr, Asr and Maghrib at the time of Maghrib. And obviously we know that the times of prayers are allotted as per the Quran, and so praying in the prescribed times. So they're missing the prescribed time, but they're praying later. That's another category. Then you've got people missing the Friday prayer without an excuse. So again, Imam al-Dhahabi mentions this as a separate major sin, because it has separate evidences for it. But the idea here is that the one that improves from that will miss the prayer in congregation without an excuse for men. So basically, according to the Hanabila and some other scholars, praying in Jama'ah is obligatory. And Jama'ah doesn't mean masjid. So praying in Jama'ah means it could be praying with your wife at home. For us, the congregation for other than an Eid Salah and Jumu'ah Salah is 2 people. So the Imam and one other person, then this is a congregation. Whereas the Jumu'ah and the Eid Salah, as we know, like the Shafi'is, we need 40 people that are from the people that are obligated. But the idea here is that if you don't pray in the masjid, you're missing out on heaps of reward. But at least as a man, you must pray in congregation. So if you're in the office, you pray with a colleague, then you've fulfilled the obligation of praying and the obligation of praying in congregation. But if you pray by yourself, munfarid, by yourself, and you're a male, then this is something that is sinful. And that's why you'll fit into the -2 category. So then if you improve beyond that, what you will do is you'll pray every single obligatory prayer in its prescribed time in congregation. And then the other aspect of it, before you become carbon neutral, is that you need to make up qada. You need to make up the missed prayers that you've missed. And this is like, again, a area where a lot of scholars go into detail. But it suffices to say that it is a debt on you, according to the vast majority of scholars, that a Muslim who misses a prayer has to make it up. So you might, and I've done this for people, you create an Excel sheet, and I might add this as a tab into the sheet because I know a lot of people may have missed prayers and these other things. But basically, you need to have the five daily salawat, and then you need to have an understanding of how many of them have you missed, and you need to make them up. Similar to like if you were to miss a fast and you would make it up, then you would also make it up. And there's an interesting debate in Usul al-Fiqh about, does an obligation that require a specific evidence to indicate upon it having to be repeated, or is the initial command to do that thing sufficient to indicate that you did it ada or qada, you did it on time or you did it later? But suffice it to say that the majority of scholars, they say that if you missed a prayer, you have to make it up. And they will stipulate how much of a priority it is. So a lot of scholars, they will say that there's no point of you praying the other prayers. So there's no point of you praying Taraweeh, and there's no point of you praying with I'll probably leave that because it's dispute over its wajibness. But let's just say praying Sunan Rawatib, the prayers before and after the adjoining prayers of the obligation. So the two before Fajr, for example. The scholars will say it's better for you to make up the missed prayers than for you to praying any other prayer. And this is just one more point I quickly want to mention because I missed it in the presentation. When we talk about the hierarchy, the obligations must come before the other things. And this is the point I was mentioning. Let me just quickly mention this and get back to the model. A big blunder that people make from a framework perspective in terms of their life is that they assume that they are free to do what they want, and they're free to do what they want from the religion. And this is not the case. And what I mean by that is you cannot do recommended acts if you are neglecting your obligations. And there's many evidences for this, such as the Hadith Qudsi about how by meaning the slave comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala closer by what he has commanded him to do. And then he becomes closer by the things that are recommended. And so this, as well as many other evidences, such as, for example, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, on his deathbed, when he's advising Umar al-Khattab, he advises him to do the obligations before the recommended actions as one of his departing advices. So some scholars will say, to the extent that if you were to do a recommended action and you were short in your obligations, that recommended action does not count. It has no weight. You will not be rewarded for it because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated you with something, and instead you turned away from that obligation and you did something that was recommended. And this is like missing the forest for the trees, or whatever the saying is. The idea is that a Muslim, a practicing Muslim who understands what is obligatory and things that are recommended, must come with the obligations, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to ask you about the recommended actions and whether you did them or not, because by definition they are recommended. But He will hold you to account for the obligations. So it's very, very important that we prioritize the obligations over the recommended actions. So a brother, for example, who is neglecting paying his zakat, there's no point of him being generous with his sadaqah and him exceedingly spending on his family beyond what is needed from the nafaqah, from the provisions that he must provide for them, and providing them with a luxurious lifestyle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to reward him for spending on his family in that way if he hasn't paid his zakat. So it's very important for us to sort of rewire ourselves that the luxury of choosing between recommended action is a level that is only unlocked, like if you want to think about it as a game, that level is only unlocked once you've come with the obligations. And that's why this is another important aspect of this model. So anyways, then the witr, obviously Hanafis would say it's wajib. It's detestable to leave it. Imam Ahmed has quotes against that as well. So then you would come with making sure that you don't miss the recommended sunan, especially those that are like emphasized. So the sunnah mu'akkada, the emphasized sunan of the prayer. Then you would go into the recommended realm of qiyamul layl, and then the nawafil, and then the saint mode would be that you're doing all of this. So you're praying your 5 daily salawat, you're praying your 10 or 12 rawatib according to your madhab, as to how many are there before and after dhuhr. So you pray your 10 or your 12, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises that person a house in paradise. And then you're praying your witr at night, you're praying your qiyamul layl before you wake up before fajr, and you're praying your nawafil extra on top of that, and you're praying that with concentration. Then this is the saint mode of that. And this is an important aspect of it, that it's additive, meaning that you're only as good as your lowest rung. So for example, if you're praying witr, but you're praying your prayers not in congregation as a man, or you're missing the prayers on their time, then you're a -3, you're not a +1. So this is a very, very important thing. وَيَاكُمْ, the obligation. Yes, Shaykh Khalid, yes, faddal. Go have some sleep, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. And actually, a good reminder, I should probably wrap this up. It's going to probably be available on YouTube anyways. So if you need to go, that's totally fine, I understand. You can watch it later. Okay, so what I'm coming back to is, to wrap this up, the idea here is that you have this as like your bird's eye view of where you're going. And what you can do here is like go across, and now like I just explained salah in detail, but I've done the same thing with all the other 19 variables of life. And then, excuse me, what you would do is you would basically figure out what level you are up to. So let's just say, for example, you're a man, but you're not praying in congregation. Let's highlight that. You are someone that maybe, for example, you're learning the diseases of the heart and you're not committing any major sins. Maybe you've memorized Juz Amma. So for the Quran, you're over here. Maybe with your mannerisms, you have left bad company and now you're trying to befriend the righteous. Now what happens is, let's give you a score. So here you're a -2, here you're a 0, here you're a +2, and here you're a 0. So what you can see here is that the total score for your worship is 0. And you also have a very clear understanding of what's your weakest point. And this is the point. Once you know what the weakest point is, this is what your goal should be. Remember how I was talking about how self-help books don't tell you what is important? This is what Islam dictates is important. So don't worry about improving other aspects. Like, dare I say, don't focus on teaching other people Quran as your next priority to become better. Rather, focus on making sure that you as a man are praying in congregation, unless you have an excuse. And so on and so forth. And the same thing happens with your finances, the same thing that happens with your family, etc., etc. So basically what happens is you get a column score, you get a category score, and then you get an overall score. And that is your final score, I guess, that you can sort of talk about. And that ranges between a -70 and a +100. So anyway, so you've got a scoreboard. So let's just score this person. So as I said, for example, they are missing the thing over here. Okay, this formula is finally working. They are learning about the diseases of the heart. They've memorized Juz Amma, and they have accompanying the righteous. So you can see here now that there's a score at a category level, and you can see as well that, like, oops, I'll zoom in so you can actually see. You can see here that like they've got a -2 here and a thing here. And so naturally what a person should do as a prioritization would be, what is the thing that I'm lacking the most in? How do I get this to a minimum of a 0? Because what you want ideally is you want every category to be 0. because then you've fulfilled the obligations and you've left the prohibition. So you're not a major sinner. And then what happens is that you then have the luxury of then doing better in those particular things. What I think I also realized from this, and this is a very important thing, is you have like you have the opportunity cost, a very important concept that I think most Muslims need to learn. It comes from economics, obviously, the idea that you've got limited resources and potentially an infinite number of things that you might need to do or want to do. And as Muslims, we obviously don't believe that needs are infinite. There's limits to what you need from a worldly perspective. But the idea here is that as a person, you have limited time. Every person has 168 hours in the week. Every single person differs in terms of how much they sleep, how much energy they have. You have limited time, you have limited resources, you have limited money. And so the idea here is that you are forced to make a decision. You are forced to say, I'm going to allocate time towards this. I'm not going to allocate time towards this. And so that's why this model is important, because it tells you what is important for you to give more time. And it tells you perhaps where are some things that you can maybe take a foot off the accelerator on so that you can allocate more time to that other thing. Now, if I go to you get the scoreboard, you get a score. I pray that your score is as high as it can be. But again, this is the sobering experience that you'll realize that it's quite lacking in most respects for most people, at least from the people that I've surveyed so far. Then what you've got is this, and this is, admittedly, a lot of this is from self-help books. It's also from a book / video that one of my colleagues highly recommended to me. And also it is a combination of a YouTuber known as Ali Abdal, who talks about productivity and all these other things. I'll conclude with this. Basically what you've got is, you've got the category, then obviously each thing has a number. That's good data practice. Then you've got the dream or the objective. Establish the prayers. And ideally you want to keep all of this short and concise. Very quickly I know, okay, I need to establish the prayer. Then, based off your scorecard, you would give it a RAG scaling. So a RAG scaling, I'll put all of these in yellow. So RAG stands for red, amber, and green. And in this example, the prayer is red. And maybe the accompanying the Quran is green. Maybe these two are orange. So you've done RAG. So you've done red, orange, green. And then obviously red means that you need to prioritize it. And then what you do is you put a why. Why are you doing this? What is the intention? And like, inshallah, I'll do another presentation on intentions in detail from a fiqh perspective. But we know that your deeds are by your intentions. Every Muslim should know this. And it's half of the equation in terms of whether your deeds are accepted. The other half being your adherence to the Sharia, meaning you do things in the right way. But the idea here is that the intention should be concise. And here you want to go through books, ahadith, Quran, maybe reminders, and think about why is it that that thing is important? Because if you don't have a solid why, if you don't have a real solid reason as to why you are doing something, then it's just another thing on a checklist. It's just another thing to do. And so you want a specific intention. The more specific I find your intention is on a particular objective, the more likely you are to be motivated to do that thing. So the reason I put first question is because we know the hadith that the feet of the slave don't move on the day of judgment until he is asked about his prayer. And if it is sound, then the rest of the actions become easy. And if it's not, then may Allah protect us. The idea is that the salah is the first thing that we are asked about. And that's why it's the first in my list. That's why the fuqaha begin it as the first thing, obviously with this condition of tahara, of purification. So salah is the first question. Now, the next thing, once you've got the intention, so let's just go through this as well. So like, we know that, okay, purify the heart. Why? يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that no one will benefit on the day of judgment, their wealth, their children will not benefit them except the one who comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a purified heart. So there's no benefit otherwise. You could be a billionaire, you could be really, really good in many other aspects of life. But if you don't purify your heart, there's nothing that will benefit you. Same thing, the Quran. It is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent as guidance. And it is something that you elevate in paradise. Like for me, it's always about how do you be honored and how do you elevate yourself on the day of judgment and your parents on the day of judgment and in the hereafter. And memorizing the Quran and having a connection to it and teaching it to others is by far one of the best ways of doing that. And the perfecting your manners, it's the heaviest deeds. Like again, if you want to be capitalist about your religion and you want to maximize the utility, as I always say in business context, you want to maximize the utility of your hereafter, the rewards that you get, the paradise that you inherit, then naturally you want to do the things that are the heaviest, the things that are the most honorable, etc., etc., the things that are the first questions, etc. So like you understand, like the why has to be there. Just saying I want to be a good Muslim because I need to pray, that won't get you the motivation to do it. Then you need a mentor, and this is really, really important. So people lack mentorship, and it's very sad. Like you can basically live your life and you can make the common mistakes, mistake after mistake, mistake after mistake. And if you have a mentor, they've been there, they've done that. If you have a sheikh to guide you, if you have a spiritual guide, if you have someone that's already memorized the Quran and he's been through the struggles and he can accompany you and can hold you accountable, then this is something that is very, very beneficial to achieving the objective. So besides the intention, you need someone to hold you accountable and someone to guide you. And that's where your mentor would come in. Now, arguably, it's very hard to have a mentor in every single part of life, but you might have a mentor for worship. You might have a mentor for finance. You might have a mentor for family. And the idea here is that you don't need to have a mentor for every line item. But what I'm trying to say is that the more mentors that you have, the better, and the more specialist that those mentors are, the better for you. So what I'm trying to say here by mafhum al-mukhalafa, by implied implication, is there's no point asking a sheikh who might be the local imam. He's probably on a $60,000 or $70,000 salary. How do you become a millionaire? Like you go to the sheikh and you say, okay, sheikh, I want to become a millionaire. What investment opportunities are there? What should I do, etc. The sheikh might not be the best person to advise you in that situation. Yes, the sheikh might tell you about halal and haram, and that's probably more important than the amount of money that you make. But the idea here is that you want to go to people of expertise, and this is what I was talking about as well, that this is a work in progress, that I want to go to people that are millionaires. I want to go to people that have, for example, from the outer appearance, that they have a very good relationship with their parents. They have a very good relationship with their parent, with their wife and their spouse and their kids. And you see them and the way that they interact and stuff. So you want to basically be able to go to them and say, teach me. Like, what do you do? How do you improve? How do I become better? What are the mistakes that I'm making? And generally, that's probably a much better way than you trying to figure it out yourself. You don't DIY a lot of these aspects. Like a wise person is the one who learns from the mistake of other people. And the person who tried to memorize the Quran and they used the methodology and maybe they did something and all these other things, those are things that you can pick up on. But I think the main thing that a mentor provides is that guidance, and secondly, accountability, which I'll come to in a second. Then what you want to do is you want to plot, what did you do in 2019? So remember how we said we want to measure ourselves. We want to hold ourselves accountable. What was the KPI in 2019? What was my sales target? Similar to that, what you'll be is like, okay, in 2019, and you don't need to do 2019, like, to be honest. You don't even need to do 2021. You can just start off with 2022. So you might as well, like, for example, just like hide these, for example, and just go, okay, what did I do this year? So what's, and what do I want to achieve next year? So like the beauty of the model is the following, that you can go back to your levels and be like, okay, for my manners to improve, I need to now avoid crude language. So crude language here isn't that you're swearing. It's like saying words that are like less ideal, less optimal. So how do you do that? So in 2020, in 2019, maybe I had bad company. So I was the level above. So I was a -1. I was hanging out with the wrong crew. Then maybe 2020 or 2021, I started to befriend the righteous. And now I've tried to avoid bad language, crude language. And so what happens is then you want to plot out what you want to achieve for the next 3 or 4 years. I don't think I think in the modern world, it's, yeah, subhanAllah, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Muhammad tried as well. Yeah, like the point about mentorship is very important, that like, I don't think anyone is free from mentorship. You could be the most knowledgeable person, but you need to have someone on top of you. And I think I find this to be one of the issues that I come across here in the Western context, where it's sort of like you have people that they gain knowledge and all these other things, and then they might think that they're head of their organization or that they're the head of a peak body or something like that. But they don't go back to the mashayikh overseas. They don't go back to their teachers and say, look, I'm dealing with this very complex issue. I need some help. I need some guidance. Can you advise me? Like, illa ma rahimallah, like there's obviously probably some mashayikh that do that, and may Allah reward them for doing so. But the idea is that you can never become the ultimate authority. And I think when you do ifta and you do all these other things, like you come across this idea that when you're making a decision and you're advising other people, if it's not based off insight and knowledge, and if you can't hang the hat on someone else or throw someone else under the bus on the Day of Judgment, then you're actually in very deep trouble. Like, again, Jazakallah khair, Suvir was telling me this as well. Like, in the fatwa course, they're told that, like, when you're giving a fatwa, imagine that you're in front of the hellfire, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask you, why did you tell this person to do this thing? Or why did you tell this person not to do this thing? Because when you are telling people, or you're teaching people, or you're telling people they should or shouldn't do this, you are talking on behalf of Allah and His Messenger. You are the ambassador or the spokesperson for the legislation of Islam. And if you advise them of the wrong thing, then you have spoken about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without knowledge, which is a major sin. And so I think what I always try to do is, before I say anything, before I do anything, I try to have a reference either from classical scholarship or modern scholarship from the mashayikh that you trust and stuff, so that if you were wrong, you have like this barrier between the direct punishment of Allah and yourself. What I mean by that is, and I know it sounds very, very crude when I say it this way, but you can throw someone under the bus. You can throw someone under the hellfire, sort of, if you were to apply that. And I know it sounds very, very rough, but basically what it's saying is that a self-interested human being who on the Day of Judgment would be willing to throw his family and run away from his mother and as we're told in the Quran, in Surah Abbas, in Abasa wa Tawalla, that like the idea is that like you want to be like protecting yourself as much as you can. And so having a mentor, having someone that guides you, having someone that like is a shield, and obviously it's like a Russian doll thing, yeah? Like that sheikh will obviously be consulting his mashayikh, and that sheikh would be consulting his mashayikh until like you're the Yoda or something, like you're the top of it. But even then, that's my point, that you would still consult a shura of people when you come across something quite difficult. And that's why mentorship is very, very important, that everyone, layman, scholar, everyone needs them. And the other aspect of it, as I said as well, is that the mentor may be a mentor in one aspect of life, but that doesn't mean that they're a mentor in all aspects of life. And this is just a common mistake that for some reason a lot of people make. It's like they go to, so for example, some people used to be like frustrated, oh, you ask a sheikh a political question, how come he comes up with something so superficial or something that's like so obviously wrong? And perhaps it's not wrong, maybe it's your perspective, but like, let's just say it is, for argument's sake, let's just say that something the sheikh says is wrong. Is the mistake on him for answering the question? Yes. But is it also a mistake on the asker that they are asking the wrong person about that particular thing? Yes. Like there's blame on you. Like, why are you asking someone about something that they don't have expertise in? Anyways, I'll continue. Basically, you want to plot how you are going. So imagine like, take a different aspect of life. Let's just say like, I don't know, you've got diabetes and you need to monitor your sugar levels. Like, unless you measure it and unless you plot it from a time-specific perspective, you don't know whether you're improving, you're progressing, or you're regressing, or what you need to do, etc. So like, my point is that there's a principle in business. You cannot manage what you don't measure. And if you don't measure what you are doing in your life in that year, how did that year go? How is it going? And you don't do these reviews, what ends up happening is you will live a life 10, 20 years later and be like, oh wow, like I've lived through 20 Ramadans, but I still haven't like memorized Juz Tabarak after memorizing Juz Amma when I was a kid. And there's many adults like that, like they've memorized parts of the Quran when they were a young child, and after that they just completely left the relationship with the Quran. So like, time flies, life is busy. Unless you've actually got something that stops you, makes you cognitively think about what your life is comprised of and how you are doing in those aspects, then arguably you won't get far. Anyways, let's continue. So then what you'll do is you plot out years, and the last thing I was saying about that is, like, no one can really plan beyond 3 years. Like, even in a business context, like, there's always these black swan events, there's all these things that happen that you don't foresee. So forecasting is only useful for like 2 or 3 years. Like, beyond that, it's like a black box. You don't know what's going to happen in life. And so it's not useful to plan out like my 10-year plan on a personal front. For example, obviously the 10-year plan is a good thing. I've spoken about it elsewhere, but we'll park that for now. But basically what you do then is you'll hide. So, and you'll basically be like, okay, this is my scoreboard. What I am now, let's just assume this was 2022, and you've got your goal for the next year. And then this is very, very important. There's lag results and lead behaviors. Okay, so this is important. That sometimes there's results that come, but the KPI that you're measuring requires a lot of behavior to be done before it. So, like, give you a quick example. Let's just say that, for example, the result that you are seeking is you want to memorize another juz of the Quran, and the juz that you're up to, you want to memorize another juz of the Quran, and the juz that you're up to is, for example, juz amma. And before you can actually memorize the next surah, Surah Al-Mursalat, or if you go from Surah Al-Mulk or something, like if you go from the front, then the idea here is that you need to like first like maybe fix your revision. You need to like maybe sit down, go through Juz Amma again, revise it, etc. That would be a lead behavior, because you're not getting the result that you want, but it is something that is contributing to it. A good example of this is the lag result that you might want is you want to write a blog every single week. The lead behavior is that you need to sit down every day for half an hour and write 200 words. Now, if you do the lead behavior, it would lead to the lag result. But the reason that you separate this or you disaggregate this is because sometimes the stuff that you want to achieve takes time. And there's like a matrix, like maybe I'll put this on a deck or something, but the effort that you put into something and the results that yield are inversely correlated, meaning that you have to do something for a very long time to see the upside of it. And typically what happens is that people start doing something, and when they don't see the results immediately, they stop. Canonical example that's probably relevant to the new year is gym memberships. So the lead behavior is to eat well, to exercise, etc. These things, like if you kept doing them, then you'll see the lag result of losing weight or becoming fitter or whatever it is, or healthier. So the idea is that the lag results are important. That's the ultimate KPI, but you also need to keep in mind the lead behavior for that particular thing. Then there's the idea of the habit. So what are the things that you need to do to be able to do that thing? And then you've got, how surprised would I be if I failed? Now, this is a very good question. Like, let's just say you rate it out of 10. So for example, you say, okay, my goal is that I want to go from memorizing only Juz Amma to also memorizing Juz Tabarak, the 29th section of the Quran. And you say, okay, like, to be honest, it's been like 5 or 10 years since I memorized another juz of the Quran. So if I failed this, I would probably be like 2 surprised out of 10. I wouldn't be that surprised. But let's just say that there's something that you're more confident in, then you should put that. And the reason that you put this score is because it leads into the next question, which is, what are the top 3 reasons you may fail? And I know this sounds like a very negative way of framing the question, but it's sort of like, how surprised would I be? Okay, if I'm very surprised, then you should have very few reasons as to why you think you would fail. But if you have a very confident view that you would, if you're very unconfident that you will actually succeed in that thing, you might have more reasons for why you would fail. So for example, the reason that you didn't memorize Juz Tabarak was because maybe you didn't find a teacher that holds you accountable or a mentor. Another reason might be that you didn't give it time. That you, for example, instead were listening to music. And obviously sins impact the acquisition of knowledge, especially the Quran. And so like, you might, when you list the reasons for why you have failed in the past, you actually become conscious of what you need to do to be able to basically achieve that. Once you understand those things, the next thing is that you need to have a weekly accountability. So this is comprising of, what did you say that you would, so every week or every month, depending on how you can meet with your mentor or your teacher, basically you'll say 3 statements. This, I said I would do, this is what I did, and this is what I'll do this week. And so what you're doing is you're sort of basically taking the big target or the goal and you're operationalizing it at the weekly level. So if, for example, you're memorizing Surah Al-Mulk, you'll be like, okay, it's about 2 and a bit pages. Maybe this week I'll memorize the first half page. Or the name of the surah and Bismillah helps me out because those 2 lines are already taken. So if I'm using a mushaf with 15 lines, I've only got 5 more lines to do and I've done half a page, mashallah. But basically you want to operationalize it at the weekly level. And accountability. And accountability, and again, this might sound weird to people, I think that we're too soft on ourselves in the West. I feel that we don't punish ourselves and we don't reward ourselves. And this is a very important part of learning from a psychology perspective. Obviously, some people do it with intrinsic motivation. Some people are like internally motivated to do something. But for those that are not, for those that find it a dredge to read the Quran, may Allah make it easy for you, or for us all actually, or they find it difficult to stand up to pray, or they find it difficult for them to wake up to pray, Fajr or something like that, or they find it difficult to go to the masjid. The idea here is that you need to use extrinsic motivations to help you out a little bit. And this is where pain and pleasure comes into it. And there's obviously in psychology, there's this whole section on the sequences of reward and punishment and the contingencies and all these other things and the frequency. But the idea here is that, I'll just give an example to sort of point this point. So let's just say, for example, you struggle to wake up for Fajr and that's your target, okay? So, and the top reason that you fail to wake up for Fajr is you sleep late. And the reason that you sleep late is because you're on your phone or on a device, whatever it may be. So there needs to be some accountability for you. And this is why I think accountability, for example, would be this. You set a time to sleep. Say it's 10 p.m. Isha is very late actually, so let's just say 10:30. So you pray Jama'ah, you come back, you go to sleep. A bit ironic given the fact that it's nearly 1 o'clock here. But let's just say that you say at 10 o'clock, I should be asleep. What happens is, if it goes to 10:01 and you are not in bed and you're not ready to sleep, you should punish yourself. And you might punish yourself by saying, I'm going to sleep on the floor. I'm not going to sleep on my comfortable bed with my blanket and my pillow. I'm going to punish myself and I'm going to sleep on the floor. And you do that night. You wake up for Fajr, obviously easier because you're not in a comfortable bed. But you wake up the next morning and you're stretching your back and you're like, oh, that was a killer. And your body physiologically learns. And you're basically okay, lesson learned. Tonight, I will make sure I sleep at 10 o'clock. And if I don't, I punish myself as well. And this is the part that's very important, that you must follow through with the punishment. If you're the teacher that always says, the student says, one more chance, sir, miss, one more chance, and you don't follow through with the punishment, or you promise the class that you'll give them a break or you will give them a reward and you don't give them that, then you've just taught them that the reward sequence isn't going to work. And so physiologically you're stuffing them up. So another quick example would be rewarding yourself. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't do. So a personal example I'd give is, in psychology, that in first year, I think there were 36 lectures, 13-week semester. Each week there was a 1 hour 3 1-hour lectures. And somehow I would come to this end of the semester and I haven't listened beyond the first lecture that I attended in person. And I've got 2 days now. 2 days to go through 39 hours of lectures. And this is something that, subhanAllah, I was able to do. I don't know what you want to call it, but how did I do it? I remember I would go to university and I'll have all my lecture slides printed, and I think that printing your slides and writing on them is one of the best ways of learning, and there's a lot of studies that back this up. But what I'll do is I'll buy, depends how unmotivated I was. If I was very, very unmotivated, I'd buy an entire cheesecake from the Woolies opposite UTS, so in that Central Park building. Downstairs, I think there's a Coles or a Woolies. And I'd get a Sara Lee cake or something, a very nice cheesecake. And I'd be and the AFIC halal certified as well, come in. And then what I'd do is I'd cut the cake. It says it serves 8, but
within that one day I'd finish the whole thing, or within the 3 hours. And the way I'd do it is I'd be okay, Shabazz, you've got 39 lectures to go through. If you finish the first lecture you get a slice of this cake. And if you finish the second lecture, you get another slice of this cake. And I would just like go like double speed or like put on VLC so you could do more than 2 times speed and just go highlight, do the work, headphones in, full focus. And the best part was when the teacher says, okay guys, I'll see you next week. And you close the recording and you just smash that piece of cake. Or when I felt like I didn't need that much motivation, I would use wafer sticks, because in a wafer packet, especially like I think if you get the home brand, it's like 90 cents or something. And in that wafer stick packet, there's like maybe 16 little wafers. And so you'd be like, okay, finish one lecture, one wafer stick, one wafer stick, one wafer stick, and just smash it. And like that small reward would actually mean something physiologically to you. And so like your brain is just like confused because you're doing something that you don't want to do, but if you do it, you get a reward instantly. And like, so you keep doing it. Or another example I'd give you is there used to be this, this course I was doing, and it was just a dredge. Like I just hated catching the train an hour, I think an hour each way, and it would be late at night and I'd just be tired. And I just like was really unmotivated to do it. So what I'll do is on the way back, if I was driving, for example, I'd go through the drive-through and get an ice cream every single lesson. And I felt like doing that meant that I was able to continue and finish off that course, for example. So my point is that you need to reward yourself. You, for example, are someone that doesn't pray Fajr in the masjid, and you muster the energy and the ability and the willpower to get up, make wudu, walk to the masjid or drive to the masjid and pray in congregation, and you get a high, like you get a natural thing. But like maybe afterwards you might be like, okay, I'm gonna go and get a manoush or something like that, just to like physiologically reward myself, if that's what you like. Or you might get a coffee or something like that. But like, you want to reward good behavior and you want to punish bad behavior. So like I said, you miss your sleep time, you punish yourself by not sleeping on your bed, sleep on the floor. You, for example, like cold showers, like all these like physiological ways of punishing yourself without harming yourself physically are things that you should try to do so. So accountability is important. Then I'll quickly finish off because I know it's pretty late. Is the next question that you would ask yourself is, how can I stack the deck to succeed? And this is like a topic that maybe I'll cover in a bit more detail elsewhere. But increasingly, I'm realizing this on a personal level, and I've read this in a lot of books like Atomic Habits and other books as well. Basically, you need to socially engineer your environment. You need to socially engineer the variables in your life to maximize the chances of good outcomes. So what I mean by this is, if you can afford or if you are able to live in a house next to a masjid, the chances that you're going to pray in the masjid have astronomically increased. If you, for example, are hanging out with the right people, the chances that you'll stop swearing and stop cursing and all these other things will increase, as opposed to a company of bad friends. So basically the idea is, how do you stack the deck to succeed? You're basically given you inherit or you're endowed with a particular hand, to use like a card example, and you're like, that's the hand that you've been dealt. That's the inheritance that you have. The intelligence that you have is a large part of that is inherited. The finances that the financial situation you find yourself in, especially in the early part of your life, is largely inherited. The family that you grow up in, the trauma that you experience, these are all things that are sort of like beyond your control. And so what you need to do is, how do I change my environment to maximize the chances of success? So the most obvious one is the people around you. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And you have the people that you spend time with, you'll notice that they will start averaging out to be like you as well. I noticed this, that like, you hang out with certain people and you start speaking the same way. You start talking, you start like looking at the same memes. Like if you're on Instagram and your friendship is restricted to just forwarding a bunch of memes or reels to particular people, and then you've got a separate list for other people. The idea is that you will start receiving memes like that, and the algorithm would work in a particular way. And so like, I want people to sort of like think very deeply about how they've stacked their deck. So this is like, let's just go through a couple of quick examples. Where you live determines so much about your life. It determines your social network. It determines whether you pray in the masjid or not. It determines the type of people you relate with. And it's not even like living close to a masjid. It's like, which masjid do I want to live next to? If you live next to a masjid that is active, there's a sheikh that's engaging the community. They're talking about relevant topics. There's a place for your kids to hang out and do youth events and all these other things. The chances of Islam being inculcated into your family increase, as opposed to living far away from a masjid or a masjid that doesn't have activities. Let's look at another aspect of life. Let's look at social media. You've got, who do you follow? So you need to learn to, like, not only, social media is like a two-way street. So you're curating your content for what you want people to see and perceive of you. But at the same time, you are in control to a large extent over the content that appears on your newsfeed. From the perspective of people that you follow, the stuff that you like. And basically the algorithm is like looking at, okay, your behavior is this, the people that you follow are like this, therefore give him this content. So what I mean by that is, if you're a brother, I don't understand why brothers follow sisters that like post photos of themselves. What are you going to get from that? She's a non-mahram. If she's good looking, it's a fitna for you. Don't tell me that you're her friend. Like just be real with yourself. Like why are you socially stacking the deck to be against you, to succeed? If part of your religion is to guard your chastity, if part of your religion is to lower the gaze, why are you stacking the deck against you, yourself? It's really like boggles my mind. So like usually like when I mentor people, one of the first things I tell them to do is open up their social media and unfollow 5 people. These are 5 people that are toxic, 5 people that like, they're always flexing what they have so you feel inadequate. These are people that you shouldn't be following because they're a non-mahram and they're like showing their aura or something. Like these are just obvious things. And then like you do that with that aspect of life. The way that you structure your room, the way that you, for example, let's just say that your objective is to read a book, to read the Quran. If you have the Quran on your desk, you're more likely to remember, oh, the Quran is here, I should probably read it. Whereas if you put your Quran on the top shelf in a bookcase that is in another room that you hardly go into, the chances of, like the non-Muslims, they give the example of a guitar. You want to play a guitar. And if you put the guitar in its case and you pack it away in a cupboard, the effort taken to sort of unpack it and to take it out and to do it, etc., takes forever. And so the chances of you picking up, learning how to play the guitar, for example, in this example, is very low. Whereas if you're someone that puts the guitar on next to their bed on a guitar stand that you can just take it out, it's automatically plugged in, you can start playing it on your bed or whenever you want, the chances of you actually learning it would be increased. Obviously, they're using it for stuff that Muslims might disagree with, especially with music and stuff. But the idea here is that you can apply those concepts to an Islamic lifestyle. So having a book of hadith or having the Quran on your desk, on a coffee table, on your dining table, these are things that increase the chances that you're actually going to pick it up and actually read it, as a means of example. Having your prayer mat rolled out already, having a place in your house that is dedicated for salah. So it's not like move the kids' toys and move this and move that, and then you're going to put the prayer mat down and then you're going to pray. Just have everything ready. Have a designated place to pray. If you're going to pray your sunnah at home, or if your wife needs to pray or whatever, you can do it that way. Now, last thing is, how many hours is that thing going to take weekly? So let's just say the 5 daily prayers, including going to the masjid and coming back, praying your sunnah, etc. Let's just say every single day it might take you an hour and a half. Just round it to say 1 hour for simplicity's sake, and say it's 7 days. So weekly hours is 7. And then typically what you want to then do as well is how many hours daily does that need? So let's just say 60, yeah? So you can connect these things. But the reason that these are two separate things is because sometimes you do something on a weekly basis that doesn't need to be done daily. So let's just say the same thing with the Quran. You want to spend an hour with it. Purifying your heart, maybe you can spend less time that. So let's just say that. Let's go like that. And then perfecting your manners, let's just say like that, like that. So now, from this perspective, it tells you how many hours in the week that you're going to dedicate to that thing, and how much time every single day you should dedicate to that thing. Now the thing here is that, a couple of things. The wakeful hours is basically taking each hour of the week is 1% of your wakeful time. The reason that wakeful life is important is because there's 168 hours in the week. And on average, if you're sleeping about 7 or 8 hours, I know most people nowadays sleep less. But the idea here is that if you want to aim for that 7 or 8 hours, the idea here is that each hour is roughly each wakeful hour is about 1% of your life. And so what we're saying is that you're giving worship 21% of your life. And this is like a really interesting way of looking at it. Let me just scoot across here so you can see what I'm saying. Now let's just say that for being debt free, you just need to figure out like how you're paying off your debts. That doesn't take really long. Let's just say 1 hour. You don't need to put a daily thing. That's an example of something weekly, like reviewing your debts, how are you paying them off, etc. Being generous, again, especially if you automate this through like a lot of charities have the automation process. Maybe every week you might jump on a Friday and donate something, or donate something here or there when you're exiting the masjid. So it doesn't take that much time to be generous. So let's just say it takes 0.5. Now, this is where it's interesting that to reach the top, this is talking about like if you're in the corporate world, how do you get to the top? Like gun for like leadership positions, or if you're in academia, how do you gun for like to become like tenure, get a PhD, get a permanent position at the university, become a celebrated academic, or if you have your own business, how do you like expand it, etc. And typically, like the minimum that people would spend on this is a 40-hour week. So we're all probably quite familiar with the 40-hour week. The 9 to 5 grind is usually more once you add transport and all these other things. So let's just say it's like 45 hours of your week goes towards that. And then like in terms of becoming a millionaire, like especially if you're doing passive investments and stuff like that, it probably takes like maybe an hour a week or so like that, maybe a bit more when you're starting off, but generally speaking, it shouldn't take you more than that. So look, like this is what's interesting, is that very quickly you can see that for your dunya, for your financial situation, it's almost half your wakeful life, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, like pretty sad as well. And that's why like it's very important to try to become a millionaire. And maybe I'll talk about this in a separate video, because if you have something that generates passive income to you at a 10% return annualized on a $1 million investment, you can earn $100,000 and pay your bills without having to work. That's why like million is always like a good number to aim for. And that's why I've got it here. Obviously you can aim to become a billionaire and other things, but the idea is that if you want to remove these 45 hours, if you want to live a life where you can retire early and you don't need to go into the rat race, and instead you can allocate almost half of your life back into other important aspects of your life, such as family, such as worship, then that's why it's there. But anyways, let's continue this. So respecting your parents. So let's just say that you live with your parents, and every day you have dinner with them, which is like say 45 minutes. So let's just say that's 45, and let's just say roughly this would equate to say something like 5 hours a week. And then your time with your wife, like away from the kids, away from family, etc. Like a dinner date once a week or something like that. Maybe you go to watch a movie, it's halal, etc. Then you got like say 2. Then like the time that you spend with your kids, ideally you want to be spending like at least half an hour with your kids every single day as well. And then like how close are you with your siblings? Like you should probably give them a phone call, talk, see them how they are, etc., etc. And your neighbors, maybe that's like an hour. Then how much time are you spending on Arabic? Well, if you're not spending more than an hour a day, probably not getting too far. If you want to become a specialist in your Islamic science, etc., etc. But what I'm trying to say is that like very quickly what ends up happening is if you scroll down to the bottom, you've got like limited hours, wakeful hours of the week. And if you allocate everything time, we haven't even added sleep. Like sleep, you're trying to do it. What is it? Actually, we don't need to because it's wakeful hours, so it doesn't really matter. But the idea here is that like very quickly you'll realize that you would be trying to achieve something in life that is physically impossible. Like especially if you're someone like maybe not everyone, but like I firstly find that I always overload. I always say yes to too many things. I always try to have too many things on my plate, and as a result of that, what ends up happening is you struggle at everything. And so like a very important part of this model, especially for young people, is you need to realize that your body has its limits. And you need to basically be able to allocate time like you allocate money in investments. Like you just need to diversify in a way that is conducive towards what you're trying to achieve. And you need to go back to the goal. Like if the goal cannot be achieved with the time that you have allocated for every single week, don't be surprised at the end of the year if it doesn't work. Like it's like a very simple thing. So when you bring the whole model together, just to conclude, because I know it's very late, you basically have those goals. You're using fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, to actually prioritize those things that are important. So you want to give more time to the stuff that's red. You can probably take your foot off the accelerator for things that are green, because again, like you need to prioritize based off the lowest thing that in the hierarchy. And then you've got your mentor holding you accountable every week or every month. You have a call with them. You're rewarding. You're conscious of why you might fail, the habits that you need to form, what are the lead behaviors, what are the lag indicators of success, and then how do you like socially engineer a world that improves your chances of success. Then ultimately that's how you would be able to sort of succeed, hopefully. But anyways, I'll probably end it there. As I said, like there's a lot to unpack. This is a model that's taken me a very, very long time to make, and it's still something that I'm sort of tinkering with every single time. Like even probably like tomorrow, as I'm planning out my next year and stuff like that, and I look back at this model, there'll probably be stuff that I'll change. But in short, hopefully everyone finds this useful. And what I'll try to do then is I'll try to share the link for this thing. So what you would do is you typically just download it, import it into your Google Drive. You've got access to it everywhere that you go, and you'll be able to sort of like basically use this. And like imagine this, like imagine you did this every single year. You'd be able to very clearly identify the parts of your life that have gone well. And if like there's a point in your life that you start seeing a trajectory downwards, you know when it happened, and you hopefully are able to sort of like react in time so that you don't hit rock bottom in that particular aspect of life. The last thing I guess I'll say as like a closing remark would be that life is tough. It's not like an easy thing. Like I know, like as I'm explaining it, it sounds like I've got all my stuff in order and all these other things, but it's far from that. Like these models and frameworks are only as good as your implementation of them. So it's very important to sort of like be realistic. And I think like the more recent stuff that I've added here on the right hand side of this Excel sheet that looks at like why you might fail, how confident you are in that particular goal, etc. Those things actually are like add the more human element to it. It's not like just like a black and white Excel sheet or a calculator that you just chuck things in and it works. And I think other than that, like, does anyone have any questions? Okay. There's one more thing that's probably I'm trying to remember, but I'm forgetting. But it's probably not that important. That's probably why I'm forgetting. So I'll end the stream there. Hopefully everyone benefited. I think we've been on for about 2 hours. And I might sort of I might add some timestamps and like break this up a little bit into smaller videos just to make it a little bit easier for people to sort of digest. But yeah, are there any other questions or anything that I've forgotten or any shortcomings that you guys can see in this? All right, Jazakumullah khair. We'll end it there.